Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of UMJOLO and SEX, where fantasies ignite and desires run wild. I am your host, Lerato Sejake, and today we are separating fact from fiction. We are debunking some of those lesbian sex myths. You might have heard it on the streets, but it is not true, or it's just whatever. Anyway, so today I am joined by a New York licensed therapist, a certified sexual health educator, and a diversity and mental wellness consultant. Yes, her name is Kumo Maseche. Thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things that she does is that she creates spaces for other identity diverse people to feel seen, heard, and accounted for. So today, she will be helping us set the record straight. When we talk about lesbians, this is South Africa, in the South African context and in the South African streets, you hear that some people say, no, she's just lesbian because she she hasn't found the right man, or no, she was just tired of men. But no, this is never the case. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. And I have a feeling whenever we're debunking myths, we're usually debunking some of the heteronormative ideas that exist. And that just means some of the ideas that are rooted in this idea that everybody should be straight, that everybody should be appealing to men, or cisgender men specifically. So when we're thinking about that particular myth, we want to hold that the world does not revolve around straight men or straight relationships, that people's sexualities and genders and experiences are far more expansive, but the way that our society has been kind of put together is such that it focuses on the experiences of straight men specifically, right? Even think about when women are dressing in a particular way, we immediately assume that they're doing it for the male gaze, that we're doing it to look nice for men. And I feel like lately, which I think is really beautiful, a lot of people who wear makeup, who do different things online are like, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because it makes me feel good. And so in that same breath, people who are lesbian are not lesbian because of an absence of a certain kind of man. It's an attraction to a different kind of human. It's a different gender altogether.
Yes, a different kind of human.
Yeah.
And then another one on the streets is that they ask you who then is the men in the relationship.
There is no man in the relationship. That's the point.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of rooted in this. Oftentimes, like, what starts to happen is we confuse gender expression, and then sexual orientation. That because a person dresses in a masculine way, we assume that means you're going to take on the role of a man, i.e. have masculine traits. And that's not necessarily the point.
Yeah, they'll be saying, okay, not he, but she will then take the bill or foot the bill when we go out on dates.
Yeah.
Like they then just place that role onto them.
Exactly. And that's rarely what happens, right? Like, people exist and have traits that are a part of their expression of sexuality in very different ways. I consider myself like a femme person, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to open the door for someone or, pay for the bill once in a while.
Yes.
And also, like, there are a plethora of lesbian relationships that you can see online, for instance, when people get married where both of them are wearing dresses. Yes. And so, like, we have to be able to differentiate gender expression from sexuality or sexual orientation.
No, definitely. So we're going to turn it up a bit and talk about the sex end of it. I was asking some of the guys I work with, when you think lesbian sex, what comes into your mind? And someone said a strap-on, another person said a dildo. But it's not always about penetration.
Yeah. So
can we talk about how lesbians have sex?
Yeah. And, I advocate that everybody in the world needs queer sex. because I think that expanding our perception of what sex looks like is helpful for everyone, because men struggle with orgasming, with getting erections, and then if that happens, we immediately assume that sex is over, that we are all going towards this goal of penetration and orgasm. And I think for the majority of us, we would probably breathe a lot better if we could hold that sex is more expansive than that. Sex is not just penetration and orgasm. Yes,
we're bringing your mouth, your tongue, your hands into the equation.
Yeah, and every person needs something different. And so we want to hold that, you know, just because you are with a man, and if there is no man present, that does not necessarily mean that penetration has to be the focus. And, you know, I think that it kind of comes up in how straight women experience sex anyway, because of this focus on penetration that society, again, has told us makes sex sex. And if it's not that, then you didn't have sex.
Yes.
And so what does that mean for lesbian women or people in same-sex relationships or people who just don't? And there are also people with a lot of sexual health problems, diagnoses like dyspareunia, which is pain with sex and pain with penetration. Are we just assuming those people can't have sex or that they don't want to? So, no. That strap-ons and dildos are not the be-all, end-all of lesbian sex.
Because we had a sex coach for another podcast that I was producing, and she was talking about how you can orgasm from like nipple play or just other things in your body. It just depends on how you're touched, how it works.
Yes.
The foreplay involved in that. Would you say that lesbians, because apparently no hand is more pleasing than your own, so would then lesbians have better sex because I know where to touch or where to go to get things going?
I want to say that I believe that lesbians have better sex than straight counterparts, not necessarily because of knowing where to go, but because they don't have this kind of tunnel vision idea of penetrative orgasm-focused sex. So that means that you have to take more of a focus on other parts of your body. We have erogenous zones all over our bodies, right? Your toes, under your feet, behind your knees, your fingers, your inner thighs. Yeah, so you have to be a lot more creative. I think as well, like if we all think about what we grew up with online, the sex was all the same. Yep, you never saw the foreplay and you didn't quite see the afterwards. You just saw this like really passionate, rushed experience, and then they were done.
Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Right. That was it. And then if you don't do that, if sex does, and like realistically, sex doesn't look like that all the time. It doesn't sound like that all the time. Like sometimes we have sex because we just want to please our partner, and sometimes we do it because we also need something out of it. So I would say that lesbians have better sex just because of the inherent need to expand what pleasure looks like.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
But then can we have quickies?
Yeah, anyone can have a quickie. What? I mean, at first we have to define what society has decided a quickie is. And then
they're thinking 5 minutes, or the world thinks 5 minutes.
5 minutes, but 5 minutes of what, right? So it doesn't quite matter what the experience is. It's just the length of time.
Alrighty, let's move on to let's talk about the LGBTIQ community as a whole. And what would your advice be for somebody who's still trying to figure out where they fit in or how to expand their sexuality or still trying to figure out their preference?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Breathe first. Labels are not the be-all, end-all. I think in many ways we live in a society that like needs answers. And so people feel a lot more shame and confusion around not having them. The Q in LGBTQIA can stand for queer, but also questioning questioning can be an identity. And also, and I think my favorite thing I learned about it is that it never has to end. There doesn't have to be an end point. It could just be that you are exploring same-sex relationships for a while, and then you feel like you want to explore straight relationships for a while. But I think that there is a lot of shame around not knowing. And so I always say to folks who come in to see me to take a breath first, because no one has said that before, that it's okay to not know. Secondly, I would say find some queer community, because this community is so comforting and warm and present. Queerness doesn't have to be in just your relationship. Queerness is a state of being. And so I would say allow queerness to be a coming to self. So that can be thinking about how you dress, how do you express yourself, try and figure out what are some of those ideas that we've been taught from society about being a person, being a woman, being a man, being a non-binary person, being a trans person, right? Because these things don't just apply to people with binaries. Think about which of those things actually apply to you.
Yeah.
Like, do you care for someone to open the door for you? Or, you know, like there's some of these things that we just put on straight relationships or people, especially if you look a certain way. And a lot of the time we don't think about whether or not those things actually apply to us. Is that how I want to experience or explore my sexuality or my relationships with people?
Yeah, so they shouldn't actually put themselves in a box and just be open to exploring and seeing where it takes you, what you're comfortable with, what makes you happy at the end of the day.
Exactly. And, you know, if a label feels good for you, by all means, take it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to. And the process to getting there, it doesn't have to look one way.
And then how can we as a society, because there is a shift that is happening in South Africa, in our families, how can friends and family be more supportive and inclusive when somebody is on that journey?
That's a great question. I think if you take anything from this, don't make it that person's responsibility to educate you about the community. If someone is exploring their sexuality, that means that they are also confronting a lot of commentary from the outside world about what you're supposed to be like, what those relationships are supposed to look like, the idea that people can tell based on looking at you. They are already kind of having to combat all of these usually unwelcome commentary from the world. So don't make it their responsibility to also then become an educator to you about the community. There are so many resources in the world that can help you do that. There are websites where you can learn. Literally, you can type anything into YouTube and you will find an educational
there's YouTube,
video.
there's Google, there's TikTok, whatever.
Exactly. And then I also think asking questions from a space of understanding, right? So if you want to understand, like, I don't want to use the wrong terminology with you. For example, if somebody is exploring gender and you want to ask them about their pronouns, right? You want to be gentle about it, be kind about it. Also acknowledge your stuff. How are you projecting what you believe about gender, about sexuality onto this person? So definitely getting in touch with what your stuff is. How is that showing up and how you're talking to the person? Are you leaving things out when you're talking to them? Because we can tell if you're just not using that person's pronouns or just not using their actual name, right? So being mindful of when your stuff is coming up, not making them an educator for you, and also asking them, how can I support you? That is the easiest way to know what to do, right? We often are like...
But not putting the entire burden on them, but just, how can I help you?
Yeah, exactly. Can I, speak up on your behalf if someone is misgendering you, or, trying to use more inclusive language when you're talking about relationships instead of saying boyfriend or girlfriend, saying partner, right? We're not assuming anybody's gender in relationships.
Yes. A lot of people are still confused. In when I walk down the street or talk to people, when you refer to people as, or when you use the pronouns they, them, they're like, who? What group are you referring to? But they're not understanding that it's a chosen pronoun for somebody, or this is how
Exactly.
they're comfortable in being addressed.
You also use it when you don't know who a person is. So, like, if someone's like, oh, I was talking to my friend, you'll usually say, oh, what were they talking about? And you'll say it anyway. So it's not a term that's universally only used for groups of people.
Thank you. I hope you're listening. Let's learn a thing or two from here. We're also learning, myself included.
Learning,
yeah. So what would you describe in your experience a healthy relationship within the LGBTQI plus community would look like?
I don't quite think it looks, the expectations or requirements are not very different to other relationships. Having open communication, trustworthiness, being compassionate with your partner. I definitely think something that I like to add is taking control of your own emotional intelligence and emotional growth. Because I think in all relationships, right, we very much like to make it the other person's responsibility to understand things about us that they might not be able to.
Yeah, and giving them the power to our happiness.
Exactly, right? Like knowing you as a person are whole and happy, and then finding a person who compliments you that is also whole and happy, and creating something together that complements both of you. I definitely think for folks in the LGBTQ community, having LGBTQ friends can be really helpful. I think that we kind of call it like a chosen family. Having people whose experiences relate to yours can be really helpful, because I think if you are a queer person, a single queer person in a group of people who are majority straight, it can kind of feel like you're invisible. It's really hard to affirm your queer identity in the context of straight spaces. It's not quite anybody's fault, but the way that the world is just naturally doesn't accommodate for expansive relationships. I also think if you are a queer person, let's say like a bisexual woman in a relationship with a straight man, it can be really important to have queer community, because it's a way for you to still affirm that part of yourself. So I definitely think community is one thing that I think
just find your people in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And another myth, speaking to relationships, is that domestic violence doesn't take place between specifically talking to, let's say, a lesbian couple. But intimate partner violence is a thing. Have you come across it in South Africa? Do people talk about it as they should? Or is it something that is still on the back burner where you're laughed at if you try go to the police station to report it?
Yeah, I mean, I think as women, we deal with that regardless of who it is, right? If you're dating a man or dating a woman, I think the same stigma exists, sadly.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a larger, or I can understand a larger sense of fear about seeking out help because of the kind of stereotypes that we ascribe to women, that we don't believe that people can be abusive in that way, and also that we are kind of labeling it as physical, because I also think that that's something that happens when people are going to report, right? That police are looking for some
they want to
physical
see a bruise
evidence
or something,
and that's not always the case. Emotional abuse can have much more, intense effects than physical, and it's a lot harder to process and understand because of the impacts that it has internally. And a lot of the time, like, physical and emotional abuse are intertwined. But when they're not, it makes it a lot harder to seek out help, because it's hard to explain to someone, especially if
they're seeking evidence.
Right, exactly. And especially because of the stereotypes that we have about what women are like. We immediately don't believe that women can exert violence on other people or on each other, which is not entirely true.
And then there's also another myth, going back to the sex, lesbian sex, particularly, that lesbians are less at risk of catching STIs, but that is not the case.
No.
Because sex is sex at the end of the day.
Please don't not use contraceptives. If you can protect yourself, do it. Make sure that you're getting tested. Swapping of bodily fluids is just as dangerous. So being mindful of that is really important. You still have to get tested. You still need to go see the gynecologist. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship you are in. Everybody is at risk still. If you are having sex, you're at risk. Yes.
Any parting advice for our audience?
Queer people exist, and we deserve to exist happily. And if you are a person who is exploring it, trying to understand it, or even in a queer relationship and struggling with how to sit with a community around you and share that, I want to encourage that your identity is not validated by other people's approval. It was just National Coming Out Day yesterday, actually.
Yes.
And so I want to give a special shout out to everybody for in the community for the bravery that you exert on a day-to-day basis in existing as you are. And that also means that I extend compassion to people who haven't yet, who are afraid to, who don't feel safe enough to. I think that that's one thing that we don't hold space for, that there are people who are having to hold this part of them internally. There are people there who will support you. There are people out there who will support you, and find them.
Yeah. With that, just remember to be kind to yourself. Don't be afraid to explore. Do not box yourself in. Learn about what makes you happy and find your people.
Find your people.
Yeah. That's it for another episode of UMJOLO and Sex. Thank you so much for joining us. It was delightful. Thank you. Thank you, Kumo.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, always a pleasure.